The early spring morning in the quiet town of Elk Ridge, Tennessee, was brimming with life. Birds chirped enthusiastically, bees flitted around blooming wildflowers, and the sprawling oak trees that lined the rolling hills swayed gently in the breeze. On the edge of this picturesque town stood a humble but warm farmhouse. Its paint was chipped in places, and the red barn out back sagged slightly with age, but the home radiated an unpretentious charm, a testament to the love and care of the family who lived there. Inside the house lived a widow named Clarice Johnson and her loyal, four-legged companion, Max, a scruffy golden retriever mix with kind, intelligent eyes. Max was Clarice's shadow, her comfort and her protector since her husband passed away 2 years prior. The bond between Clarice and Max ran deep, the kind of relationship forged by shared grief and the quiet understanding that neither of them had to face life alone. Clarice often said Max had a heart as big as Tennessee, always giving, always loving. That morning, as the sunlight broke through the gray remnants of winter, Max bounded out of the house and into the sprawling fields with his usual enthusiasm. It was his favorite part of the day, exploring the woods behind the property, chasing squirrels, and sniffing out every inch of his territory. Clarice would watch him from the porch, sipping her coffee, smiling as she muttered, "He's a free spirit, that one." But something was different that day. As Max sniffed the base of an old oak tree near the woods, his ears perked up and his body froze. A faint, high-pitched sound drifted through the air, a desperate, rhythmic squeaking. Max followed the sound with careful steps, his tail wagging uncertainly. Beneath the gnarled roots of the tree, partially obscured by fallen leaves, he found a tiny, pitiful sight. 3 baby squirrels, huddled together, trembling and letting out distressed cries. Their eyes weren't even fully open yet, their fur thin and patchy. They looked barely a few days old, utterly helpless. Max sniffed the babies, his warm breath ruffling their fragile bodies. There was no sign of their mother. Perhaps she had fallen victim to a predator, or maybe the recent storm had scattered the nest too far for her to find her way back. Whatever the reason, it was clear that these tiny creatures were alone, and without intervention, they wouldn't survive the day. From her spot on the porch, Clarice noticed Max lingering at the tree. "Max, what have you got there?" she called out, setting down her coffee. Max looked back at her, his eyes wide with urgency, before gently taking one of the babies in his mouth and carrying it toward her. Clarice gasped when she saw the tiny creature. "Oh my stars, what on earth?" She knelt down as Max carefully placed the baby at her feet, then dashed back to retrieve the other 2. Clarice examined the fragile beings, her heart breaking for their plight. She had always been an animal lover, but this was a new challenge entirely. Raising squirrels? She wasn't sure she had the faintest idea how to do that. Max sat beside her, wagging his tail expectantly, as if to say, "We can't just leave them, can we?" Clarice let out a long sigh, her mind racing. "Well, I suppose we'll figure it out together, won't we, boy?" she said, scratching Max behind the ears. He leaned into her touch, his soft eyes brimming with trust. With Max watching closely, Clarice gently gathered the baby squirrels into a shoebox lined with an old towel. She could feel their tiny bodies trembling under her touch. They were so small, so fragile. Back inside the house, Clarice placed the box on the kitchen counter and opened her laptop, frantically searching for advice on caring for orphan squirrels. She learned they would need feeding every few hours, warmth, and constant care, tasks that would be challenging for a woman her age. Yet, as she glanced over at Max, who had placed himself protectively beside the box, his nose pressed against the edge to sniff the babies, she felt a flicker of hope. If anyone had the patience and devotion to help her with this, it was Max. Over the next few days, Clarice and Max established a routine. Clarice would mix formula and feed the babies with a tiny syringe, while Max stayed by her side, watching with unwavering attention. He seemed especially taken with the smallest of the 3, a runt Clarice affectionately named Peanut. Whenever Peanut squeaked in discomfort, Max would nuzzle him gently, his soft snout bringing a sense of calm to the tiny creature. Clarice often joked, "You're better at this than I am, Max." Despite their best efforts, the work was grueling. Clarice found herself waking up every 2 hours at night to feed the squirrels, her body aching with exhaustion. Sometimes the sheer enormity of the task left her wondering if she'd made the right decision. But every time she looked at Max, his golden eyes full of determination and love, she found the strength to keep going. As the days turned into weeks, something miraculous began to unfold. The squirrels started to grow stronger. Their fur thickened, their eyes opened, and they began exploring their makeshift nest in a corner of the living room. Max remained their ever-watchful guardian, even stepping in to clean them with gentle licks when Clarice wasn't looking. It was an odd sight, a big, lumbering dog doting on 3 tiny squirrels, but it filled the farmhouse with a warmth that Clarice hadn't felt in years. Yet, beneath the joy of watching the squirrels thrive, Clarice couldn't shake a nagging worry. These were wild animals, after all. Was it even possible for them to bond with a dog? And when the time came, would they be able to return to the wild, or had Max's love and care made them too reliant on him? Little did Clarice know, this unconventional family was about to face challenges that would test their bond in ways she couldn't have imagined. The days turned into weeks, and Clarice watched with a mix of amazement and concern as the bond between Max and the baby squirrels deepened. It was no longer just a matter of survival. The squirrels had come to see Max as their protector, their warmth, and even, in some strange way, their parent. Peanut, the smallest and most timid of the 3, rarely left Max's side, often curling up in the soft fur of his chest to nap. The other 2, whom Clarice had named Pip and Hazel, had grown bolder, hopping around the living room with newfound energy, but they too would return to Max when they needed comfort. It was a sight that brought Clarice joy, but it also weighed heavily on her heart. She couldn't help but worry about what this unusual bond might mean for the squirrels' future. They were wild animals, after all, and she knew they couldn't stay in her home forever. The time would come when they'd need to return to the woods where they belonged. But how would they survive out there, having bonded so closely with a dog? One particularly brisk morning, Clarice's concerns took on new weight. She was in the kitchen brewing tea when she heard an unusual commotion outside. The back door creaked open as she stepped onto the porch to investigate. Max was in the yard, barking furiously, his golden fur bristling. At first, Clarice couldn't see what had him so riled up, until a sharp predatory cry split the air. Her heart dropped. It was a red-tailed hawk, perched menacingly on a low branch of the oak tree that shaded the yard. Its piercing eyes were fixed on the ground, where Pip and Hazel were clumsily scurrying around, exploring the world outside the safety of the farmhouse for the first time. "Max!" Clarice called, panic surging through her. "Bring them inside." But Max was already in action. With a protective growl, he darted between the hawk and the squirrels, positioning his broad body like a shield. The hawk flapped its wings, letting out another shrill cry as it took off, circling above the yard, clearly unwilling to surrender its potential meal. Pip froze in terror, and Hazel let out a high-pitched squeak. Max barked louder, his tone almost desperate, as if he were ordering them to retreat to safety. Clarice rushed to the yard, scooping up the squirrels as quickly as she could. She cradled them against her chest as the hawk finally gave up and soared into the distance. Max let out a low whine, sniffing them to make sure they were unharmed. Clarice's hands trembled as she held the tiny creatures close. It had been a close call, too close. Back inside, Clarice placed Pip and Hazel in their box while Peanut, who had been napping safely on Max's back during the ordeal, chirped curiously, unaware of the danger his siblings had faced. Clarice collapsed onto the couch, running a hand through her graying hair. "Max, what are we going to do?" she murmured, her voice heavy with worry. Max sat beside her, resting his head on her lap. His eyes, filled with loyalty and love, seemed to say, "We'll figure it out together." But Clarice wasn't so sure. The hawk was just one of many dangers the squirrels would face in the wild. She had taken them in to save their lives, but had she unknowingly doomed them by making them too dependent on her and on Max? The turning point in their quiet lives came a few weeks later. The squirrels were now old enough to start venturing outside more often, and Clarice had built a small outdoor enclosure for them in the yard. It was meant to help them acclimate to the sights, sounds, and smells of the outdoors, a gentle step toward their eventual release. But no matter how much Clarice tried to encourage them to explore, the squirrels always seemed to gravitate back to Max. One evening, as the sun dipped low and bathed the farm in golden light, Clarice sat on the porch, watching Max and the squirrels. Pip and Hazel were playfully chasing each other around Max's legs, while Peanut sat perched on Max's head, his tiny claws gripping tufts of fur. It was a scene so pure, so full of unexpected love, that Clarice felt tears prick her eyes. Yet, the sight also reminded her of the inevitable. The squirrels couldn't stay here forever. They needed to learn to fend for themselves, to climb trees, to forage for food. But how could she teach them that when all they knew was the safety of Max's care? As if sensing her turmoil, her neighbor, George, appeared at the edge of her yard. George, a retired wildlife rehabilitator, had lived in Elk Ridge for decades. He had been the one to suggest the outdoor enclosure, and he often stopped by to check on Clarice and the animals. "They're getting big," George said with a smile, nodding toward the squirrels. "Won't be long before they're ready to head out on their own." Clarice sighed, her gaze lingering on Max, who was now gently licking Peanut's head. "I don't know if they'll ever be ready," she admitted. "They don't act like squirrels anymore. They act like Max." George chuckled softly, but his expression turned serious. "That's because he's given them love, Clarice, and love has a way of changing things. But don't underestimate them. Nature has a way of calling animals back to what they're meant to be." Clarice wanted to believe that, but doubt gnawed at her. What if they don't know how to survive out there? What if I've kept them here too long and they can't go back? George placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've done your best, and so has Max. But at some point, you have to let them try. The world out there might be dangerous, but it's where they're meant to be. And you'll be surprised how much strength they have in them." Clarice nodded, though her heart felt heavy. That night, as she watched Max curl up on his bed with all 3 squirrels nestled against him, she couldn't shake the fear that she was about to lose the family she hadn't known she needed. But she also knew George was right. The time to let go was approaching, and it was going to test all of them, Max, the squirrels, and Clarice herself, in ways they weren't prepared for. The first crisp morning of fall arrived with a quiet urgency in the air. The leaves on the oak trees surrounding Clarice's farmhouse had started to blush with hues of orange and crimson, and the scent of earth and decay signaled the coming change of seasons. It was a bittersweet reminder to Clarice that time was running out. She couldn't delay much longer. If the squirrels were ever going to survive on their own, they needed to be released before the frost set in. Clarice sat on the porch, with a mug of tea cradled in her hands, her gaze fixed on Max, who lay sprawled in the yard. Peanut was perched on his back as usual, nibbling on an acorn, while Pip and Hazel scurried around the enclosure, play-fighting and climbing the small branches Clarice had placed inside. From a distance, it looked like a scene plucked from a children's storybook, an idyllic image of harmony between creatures so wildly different that their bond seemed almost magical. And perhaps it was. But Clarice knew the truth. The world beyond her yard wasn't a storybook. It was full of predators, bitter cold, and the harsh reality of survival. The thought of Pip, Hazel, or Peanut facing that world alone was almost too much to bear. Yet, Clarice also knew she couldn't keep them forever, not without risking their lives in another way, animals at heart, and if she held on too tightly, she would be doing them a disservice. She let out a heavy sigh, her breath misting in the cool air. "Max," she called softly. The old dog lifted his head, his ears twitching at her voice. "It's almost time, boy." Max's tail thumped lazily against the ground, as if he didn't quite understand the weight of her words. But Clarice saw something in his eyes, something that told her he knew more than she gave him credit for. That afternoon, Clarice made her decision. She called George over to help her prepare. Together, they moved the squirrels' enclosure closer to the edge of the woods and left the door open, giving the squirrels a choice. They could explore, or they could stay. Clarice hoped that this gradual release would help them acclimate, that they would start to feel the pull of the wild. But the first attempt didn't go as she had hoped. Pip and Hazel ventured out briefly, climbing a low-hanging branch before scurrying back to the safety of Max's side. Peanut didn't even leave the enclosure. Instead, He climbed onto Max's paw and chirped insistently, as if demanding reassurance. "They're not ready," Clarice muttered, her voice tinged with frustration and worry. George crossed his arms, his face thoughtful. "It's not that they're not ready, Clarice. It's that they don't know how to let go. They've grown up with Max. They trust him. And trust like that doesn't disappear overnight." Clarice nodded, but the knot in her chest remained. She couldn't force them, but she also couldn't wait much longer. She needed a sign, something to tell her she was doing the right thing. The sign came 3 days later, though not in the way Clarice had hoped. It was late afternoon when she heard the barking, loud, frantic, and desperate. Max rarely barked unless there was trouble, and the sound sent Clarice's heart racing. She rushed outside, following the noise to the edge of the woods. There, she found Max circling a small, thorny bush, his golden fur bristling. Pip and Hazel were nowhere to be seen, but Peanut's distinctive high-pitched chirps came from deep within the tangled branches. Clarice dropped to her knees, her hands trembling as she parted the thorny vines. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw Peanut, his tiny body pinned under a heavy branch that had fallen from the tree above. "Oh no, Peanut," Clarice whispered, her heart sinking. Max let out a low whine, pawing at the ground near the bush. Clarice worked quickly, her hands scratched and bleeding as she pried the branch away and gently lifted Peanut into her hands. The little squirrel was trembling, his chest heaving with shallow breaths. His back leg was twisted at an odd angle, and Clarice's stomach churned at the sight. She carried him back to the farmhouse, Max following closely, his nose pressed against her arm as if to reassure both Peanut and himself. Clarice placed Peanut in his box and examined him as carefully as she could. She'd seen enough injured animals in her time to know that his leg was likely broken. He would need time to heal, and that meant delaying the release for all 3 squirrels. As she bandaged Peanut's tiny leg, tears streamed down her face. "I'm so sorry, little one," she murmured. Max sat beside her, resting his head on the table, his eyes filled with worry. The accident was a wake-up call for Clarice. As much as she loved the squirrels, as much as Max loved them, she couldn't ignore the fact that they weren't equipped for life in the wild. Not yet. She realized that she'd been so focused on letting them go that she hadn't properly prepared them. She had assumed that love and care would be enough, but it wasn't. They needed more than that. They needed the skills and instincts that only time and nature could provide. Over the next few weeks, Clarice and Max worked together to change that. Clarice expanded the outdoor enclosure, filling it with branches, leaves, and other materials that would mimic their natural habitat. She stopped hand-feeding Pip and Hazel, instead scattering food for them to find on their own. Max, for his part, seemed to understand what Clarice was trying to do. He began encouraging the squirrels to climb higher, nudging them toward the branches when they hesitated and barking softly whenever they grew too complacent. Peanut, meanwhile, stayed inside to heal. Clarice worried that his bond with Max might grow even stronger during this time, making it harder for him to adapt later. But to her surprise, Peanut started to show signs of independence. He began exploring the living room on his own, climbing onto the back of the couch and scurrying across shelves. Clarice watched with a mixture of pride and sadness as he practiced jumping, his tiny body wobbling but determined. As the first frost crept in, Clarice knew the time was finally approaching. The squirrels were stronger, more confident, and better prepared. Still, she couldn't shake the ache in her chest. She had poured so much love into these tiny creatures, and the thought of letting them go felt like losing a part of herself. One evening, as she sat with Max on the porch, she turned to him and said, "You've done so much for them, Max. You've been their protector, their family, but they're going to have to leave us soon. Do you think they'll be okay?" Max didn't respond, of course, but as he rested his head on her lap, his eyes seemed to hold an answer. "We've given them everything we could. Now it's their turn." The day had finally come. The morning was crisp and clear, with a gentle breeze rustling through the amber leaves. Clarice stood at the edge of the woods, her heart heavy but resolute. Beside her was Max, his tail wagging slowly, though his eyes held an unmistakable sadness. Pip, Hazel, and Peanut were inside the outdoor enclosure for what Clarice knew would be the last time. The three squirrels had grown so much in the past few weeks, their coats thick and glossy, their movements confident and quick. Even Peanut, despite his injury, had made a full recovery, bounding around with a vigor that rivaled his siblings. Clarice clutched the latch of the enclosure door, her hand trembling. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind a dozen times, but now that it was here, the weight of it felt almost unbearable. These tiny creatures had become her family, filling the quiet spaces of her life with purpose and love. Letting them go felt like breaking off a piece of her own heart and leaving it in the woods. She glanced down at Max, who was sitting patiently at her feet, his gaze fixed on the squirrels. Peanut chirped from inside the enclosure, tilting his tiny head as if to ask, "What now?" Clarice knelt beside Max, wrapping an arm around his soft fur. "It's time, boy," she whispered, though the words felt as much for herself as for him. "They're ready. We've done everything we can." Max leaned into her touch, his eyes never leaving the squirrels. It was as if he understood the gravity of the moment, the bittersweet mix of pride and loss that Clarice felt. Taking a deep breath, Clarice unlatched the door and stepped back. For a moment, nothing happened. Pip and Hazel remained at the far corner of the enclosure, their noses twitching as they sniffed the cool morning air. Peanut hesitated near the doorway, his tiny body trembling slightly. Clarice felt a pang of doubt. What if they weren't ready? What if they didn't know what to do? But then something remarkable happened. Max took a step forward, his tail wagging gently. He let out a soft, encouraging bark, a sound Clarice had heard countless times during the squirrels' outdoor practice sessions. It was his way of saying, "Go on. It's okay." Pip was the first to respond. He darted out of the enclosure, his bushy tail flicking behind him as he climbed a nearby tree with surprising agility. Hazel followed shortly after, pausing at the base of the tree to glance back at Max and Clarice before scrambling up to join her brother. Clarice felt tears welling up in her eyes as she watched them explore the branches, their small bodies silhouetted against the golden light filtering through the leaves. But Peanut didn't move. He stood just inside the doorway, his tiny claws gripping the wooden frame. His dark eyes darted between Max and the open woods, his body quivering with indecision. Clarice knelt down, her voice soft and soothing. "It's okay, Peanut. You can do it. You're stronger than you think." Max took another step forward, lowering his head so that it was level with Peanut's. The little squirrel let out a hesitant chirp, and for a moment Clarice thought he might turn back. But then Max nudged him gently with his nose, as if giving him one final push of encouragement. Peanut chirped again, this time louder, more confident, and then, with a sudden burst of energy, he leapt out of the enclosure and scurried toward the tree where Pip and Hazel were waiting. Clarice's breath caught in her throat as she watched Peanut climb, his movements a little clumsy but determined. He made it to the first branch, then the second, until he was high up in the tree, his small form barely visible among the leaves. The three squirrels chirped to one another, their voices blending with the rustle of the wind. It was the sound of freedom. Clarice wiped her eyes, a mixture of pride and heartbreak flooding her chest. "They did it," she murmured. "They're really doing it." Max sat beside her, his gaze fixed on the tree. His tail wagged faintly, but Clarice could see the melancholy in his eyes. For months, these squirrels had been his family, his purpose. Letting them go was as hard for him as it was for her, maybe even harder. That night, the farmhouse felt impossibly quiet. The living room, once filled with the sounds of tiny claws scurrying across the floor and the soft chirps of playful squirrels, now seemed empty. Max lay in his bed near the fireplace, his head resting on his paws. He looked up at Clarice as she sat on the couch, a book open in her lap but unread. "They'll be okay," she said aloud, though the words were as much for herself as for him. "They're where they're meant to be now." Max let out a soft huff, his eyes drooping closed. But Clarice could tell he wasn't sleeping. He was listening, waiting, as if hoping to hear the familiar chirps of the squirrels outside. The following days were a strange mix of relief and longing. Clarice often found herself looking out the window, scanning the trees for any sign of Pip, Hazel, or Peanut. Max spent more time than usual near the edge of the woods, his ears perked and his nose to the ground, as if searching for traces of his little family. And then, one afternoon, they came back. Clarice was in the kitchen washing dishes when she heard Max barking, an excited, joyful bark that she hadn't heard in days. She rushed to the porch and saw him standing near the old oak tree, his tail wagging furiously. In the branches above, 3 familiar shapes darted between the leaves, their chirps filling the air. It was Pip, Hazel, and Peanut. Clarice felt a lump rise in her throat as she watched the squirrels climb down the tree, stopping just out of reach but close enough for Max to see them. Peanut chirped the loudest, his tiny body quivering with excitement as he bobbed his head toward Max. It was as if they were saying, "We're okay. We're still here." Max barked again, his whole body wagging now. Clarice laughed through her tears, her heart swelling with joy. She didn't know how often the squirrels would return, or if they would eventually move deeper into the woods and never come back. But for now, they were here. And that was enough. That evening, Clarice sat on the porch with Max by her side. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. The squirrels were gone again, but their brief visit had left her heart lighter. She reached down to scratch Max behind the ears, her voice soft and full of gratitude. "We did it, Max," she said. "We gave them a chance, and they're going to be just fine." Max looked up at her, his golden eyes shining with a mix of love and understanding. He rested his head on her lap, and for the first time in weeks, Clarice felt a deep, abiding peace. The bond they had shared with those tiny creatures would never fade, no matter where life took them. And as the first stars appeared in the night sky, Clarice whispered a quiet prayer of thanks for the squirrels, for Max, and for the unexpected love that had changed all their lives forever. In the weeks that followed, the rhythm of life on the farm began to settle again. The squirrels didn't come back every day, but when they did, their visits were filled with joy. Pip and Hazel would dart through the branches with playful energy, while Peanut often lingered closer, chirping softly at Max as if recounting his adventures in the wild. Each visit felt like a blessing, a reminder that the love and care Clarice and Max had poured into those tiny creatures hadn't been in vain. For Clarice, the experience left her profoundly changed. She had opened her home and heart to something unexpected, and in doing so, she found a piece of herself that had been buried beneath years of loss and loneliness. The squirrels had been more than just a responsibility. They had been a source of healing, teaching her that love doesn't have boundaries, whether it's between species or the most unlikely of friends. Max, too, had changed. Though he was still Clarice's faithful companion, there was a quiet wisdom about him now, a contentment that came from knowing he had done something extraordinary. He had stepped into a role no one would have expected of him: protector, teacher, and even parent. And though the squirrels had returned to the wild, Max's bond with them would always be a part of him. One crisp fall morning, Clarice sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders and a steaming mug of tea in her hands. Max lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws, his eyes half closed in the golden light of the rising sun. The woods were alive with the sounds of birds, rustling leaves, and the occasional faint chirp that Clarice swore sounded like peanuts. She glanced down at Max and smiled. They're out there, living their lives just like they're supposed to. Max's tail thumped softly against the wooden porch, and Clarice felt a surge of gratitude wash over her. Life had a way of bringing the unexpected to her door, but it also had a way of teaching her that letting go wasn't the end. It was just a new beginning, for the squirrels, for Max, and for herself. As the sun rose higher, casting its warmth over the farm, Clarice whispered softly to the wind, "Thank you." It was a prayer, a promise, and a reminder that love, no matter how unusual or unexpected, always finds a way to leave its mark.